Hello, so this is the second Ask Me Anything. I decided to do this series sort of on a monthly basis just to get out of the way a bunch of questions and comments that I had that are a little bit too long for me to reply via email or comment section, but really aren't long enough or sophisticated enough for me to really justify an entire response video. So this month I really have just three main questions that I want to address, but they're fairly long, so I think it'll make a substantive video regardless. So the first question I have brought to me in this Ask Me Anything is one by my friend Ben McLean. You should all go subscribe to his channel. It's really good, mainly about philosophy and gaming and the likes. But he had an objection to my recent video concerning the difference between narratives and arguments, and specifically why narratives are so much more compelling to most humans than are logical arguments. And of course, he remained largely unconvinced that narratives were more compelling even after I had numerous examples of historic speeches, and he wanted me to give some kind of example of my own. And I thought about this, maybe I could give some kind of argument and narrative and demonstrate why one is superior, but I think a better place to look is in the actual logical theory and the actual sociological theory for why narratives are so much more appealing to humans than are logical arguments. I think a real perfect example is something called the conjunction fallacy. This is not really a logical fallacy, but it is a demonstrated sociological result, a demonstrated sociological flaw in how humans think. And this conjunction fallacy is simply the tendency for humans to place higher probabilities on specific events than they do on general events. Okay, what does that even mean? So the classic example would be, I could give you an event that says, Sandy has cancer. And then I give you another event that says, Sandy has cancer and Sandy smokes. And then I'd ask somebody, okay, which of these events is more probable? And most people will say the event that Sandy has cancer and Sandy smokes, because we all know that smoking causes cancer, but of course it's absolutely wrong. The first event that had only the single event in it was the more probable one. And of course, it's impossible for a specific event to have more probability than the general one, because I added more conditions on. Yet again and again when we test this in psychological experiments, we see that humans pick specific events over the general case when those specific events form a narrative that they can actually work into a worldview. Now, I think this kind of demonstrates sort of a fundamental flaw in human thinking. When we have just all these divergent facts, when we just see fact A, fact B, we have to connect them with a narrative, otherwise we can't really internalize them, we can't really process them in our minds, and subsequently they're very, very difficult for us to deal with. And so I think the corollary of this is that when we get just a bunch of divergent facts, we naturally try to add facts in order to get them into a more believable narrative. So we'll hear that Sandy has cancer, and we might just, even from just that event, we might assume that she must have been a smoker or something, just something that would explain that random event so we could build it into a story in our minds. And a really great example of this came up just this week in a controversy between a YouTube vlogger, Bering, who very popular, I'm sure everyone knows him, and another vlogger, Demotivator Opinion, which I've had on this channel to discuss things. And their controversy was over a TEDx talk in which a completely fictional rape was described in very, very sporadic details. It was a fact here, a fact there, and then the speaker asserts that it's rape. And there is a disagreement between Bering and Demotivator and a few other of the pro-feminist male vloggers on the web over whether this was actually a rape or not. And I'll just play the clip here.
She heads to a campus party where she sees a guy that she has a crush on. Let's call him Brett. The next day, Sarah wakes up with a pounding headache. She can only remember the night in flashes, but what she does remember is throwing up in the hall outside Brett's room, then silently staring at the wall while he was inside her, wanting it to stop, then shakily stumbling home. She doesn't feel good about what happens, but she thinks maybe this is just what sex in college is.
Okay, so what do we have in this hypothetical fictional scenario that's described? Well, it's a series of facts. A girl had a crush on a guy. She goes to a party. She gets very, very drunk. She's blacking out. She vomits. They have sex. And later on, she doesn't like it. She regrets it. And the question is, did rape occur? Well, flatly on the facts, it's very, very difficult to tell. The situation is incredibly suspicious. It seems that it's very, very difficult to kind of process what exactly happened, but we don't really have a lot of information. And so I noticed that in the controversy online, Bering just looked at the plain facts and said, not enough information, we can't tell whether a rape occurred, even though I think anyone would say that's suspicious. That situation is very, very suspicious. It sounds like rape probably did occur or something, even though we don't have enough information. Whereas people like Demotivator and the other progressives, they were more convinced that a rape had occurred because they felt that this sort of told a story. These series of facts were not just held in isolation. They had to be part of something bigger, right? So the fact that she was vomiting and had sex and was blacking out, just you could fill in the gaps, right? You knew at that point that, the guy must have been the one to initiate, which we do not know, but of course they assumed because it told the story, right? We knew that she had to not have given verbal consent, which again we do not know, but the story sort of implies it, and from that you get the full rape scenario that they think happens. Now, what this is called, just the basic facts, what this is called is sort of a prima facie case. It's a case that can be made that something appears to be guilt, but without sort of doing further investigation, we really do not have enough information to say convict the person. And this is something that's oftentimes used in corporate law and discrimination law in lawsuits. You can construct a prima facie case because it's assumed that in due diligence, the person who's defending themselves will spend money to make the full facts known. Whereas in cases of criminal law, this is very rarely the case. The litigants might be unable to defend themselves, someone might be dead or hurt, or in the case of rape, nobody remembers, so the investigation just can't occur. And for this reason, criminal cases usually cannot be made purely on prima facie case. But this just sort of illustrates how a powerful narrative is, because even with those sporadic facts, I could see every time Demotivator Opinion talked about this, they couldn't help themselves from adding facts in. It was, and I don't blame them, because the first time I saw this TEDx talk, I couldn't help too but sort of add facts in, because without those additional facts, the story is just disconnected things that happened to this one girl, and it's impossible to form a narrative about what happened. And when I don't have a narrative about what happened, then I can't encapsulate the story and make it easier for my mind to process. So I naturally form it into a narrative. And I think this is a perfect example of how narratives will sort of trump just the pure logical statements of the case. And you can see this real time in this massive controversy that's been going on Bering's channel. So I thought that was a kind of interesting example of this in action. Okay, so the second question I wanted to answer was another question brought to me by a fellow YouTuber, Missing the Mark. I recommend his channel. You should go take a look at it. I'll leave a link in the description. And he was responding to a video I made kind of poking fun at nihilism. It was in response to another atheist who calls himself a nihilist called Wizard of Cause. Now, broadly, it's no secret that I just really have a distaste for nihilism. It's the stupidest philosophy ever. Once you say that you don't believe in anything, once you say that you do not think that there are any normative statements that can be made externally to your own opinion, then what further conversation can there be? The only thing we're really having conversations about are preferences at that stage. And I'm not even so sure why I should listen to somebody like that. All they're going to be doing is describing their preferences one day, and for all I know, they could be the same. They could be the same or they could be different tomorrow. And so I kind of made this in a poking fun sort of way in the video, and Christopher at Missing the Mark sort of posted back with a more well-developed nihilistic argument, and he put it in a kind of compelling way as sort of the atheist Emperor Palpatine from Star Wars. I'll just play that now.
Most atheists are materialists, and materialists are determinists. If there is no such thing as free will, then you've got to do what you've got to do. If that means talking as if there is an objective standard after having just denied it, well, they had no choice in the matter. Being a determinist means never having to say you're sorry. Unless you do.
Alright, so the first argument that's more well developed in favor of nihilism, or at least in favor of being able to have discussions when you are a nihilist, is that, well, it's determinism, and what else are you going to do?
Answer 1B. There is nothing which prevents one from subjectively valuing one's preferences and furthermore valuing imposing them upon others. All that is required is an alliance of those who value the same thing. Most of us do not like murder, so we can band together and our shared subjective preferences become objective within our shared reality. Of course, this only works in practice for a few preferences, and not enough to live in an ordered society, which is why the limit of democracy is empire.
So the second point he makes is that you can kind of construct some descriptive normality or descriptive normative conditions just by looking at the majority will, the commonality of everybody's individual opinion. And that's another thing that you hear commonly, and it's followed up by sort of a third and ultimate point about making statements as a nihilist.
Which brings us to answer 2. The will to power. Nietzsche strikes back. Our thoughts may cease to exist when we stop believing in them, but our actions are real. For whatever reason we did what we did, we have done it. If we see no meaning in life, our actions keep existing. If we act like our actions have meaning, then with regard to our other actions, they do.
And that's another thing that you hear commonly, and it's followed up by sort of a third and ultimate point about making statements as a nihilist. And that is that if your will itself creates meaning, if you reject meaning, then just by placing meaning on said idea or said principle will give it the meaning that it lacks in the external universe. This is sort of the Nietzschean or existentialist perspective on meaning being manufactured in a meaningless universe. So these are the arguments in their more sophisticated form. And what's my response? Well, I think a lot of people over the years have made these arguments. Obviously, these are largely arguments that came out of Nietzsche and then were repeated by people in the French existential movement in the early 20th century. But I think that the response really comes down to not that you can't live this way, but that, and not even that you can't have public discourse in this way, but exactly what are the constraints on public discourse if you did believe these things? Notice that each one of these arguments, the argument from determinism, the argument from popularity, and the argument from will, each one of these arguments has no relation to logic or reason or evidence. They're just arguments for making assertions qua assertions. So I could say the moon is made of green cheese, or A and not A, and that could equally be justified under the assertion of determinism, the assertion of popularity, or the assertion of will. I could will it that A is not A, or I could will that the moon was made of green cheese. I could take a poll and find that everyone believed that the moon was made out of green cheese, or that everyone believed the A and not A. And I could also, ultimately just say, well, I believe the A is not A and the moon is made of green cheese, and what can you do about it? But at the end of the day, none of these statements about assertions connects them to evidence or connects them to rationality. There's no concept of truth, of goodness, or any external nature to any of these assertions. They're just justifications of the assertion, period. And as such, we are left with a discourse that isn't so much non-existent as it is irrational. My emotions count as much as my logical arguments. My misperceptions and delusions count as much as the arguments I made from considered evidence. And everything sort of becomes radically interchangeable, and the result isn't necessarily what people think it is. I think when the existentialist authors considered a world where people sort of just live their lives without rationality, they live their lives just from their emotion, from their pure pathos, they imagined something that was more liberated, something that was more freeform. And you see this in their art, like the theater of the absurd. But nothing like this is the case, and if nothing else, the generation of social justice warriors should really sort of vindicate the belief that it's not going to be this free-form, anything-goes philosophy. Because in a world where emotions count as much as facts, it's not a world where anything goes, it's a world of tyranny. Because at the end of the day, somebody's emotions have to be the last word. And to cement that authority, government will be brought in eventually, because if nothing else, government can brook no controversy. And so we'll end up only with a tyranny which will not be pliable by either rationality or evidence, and a tyranny against which no rational or empirical objection can be brought to bear, which is actually quite terrifying. So nihilism, it leads sort of nowhere, but if you really push it in sort of the Nietzschean direction and say, okay, I want to take nihilism and justify it in terms of will, it leads to tyranny, it leads to oppression, it leads to meaningless conversations that have no rhyme or reason to them. And I don't know, I don't see that as being any better. All right, so the last question I wanted to answer in this Ask Me Anything video was a message that was posted to me about a month ago, largely concerning sort of a logic trap that's common among atheists. I am not exactly so sure how I'm going to rehash this because it was quite a long conversation. But broadly, he asked me a question about whether I believe in miracles, which I do. He asked me, do I believe if God answers prayers? And I do, I'm a Catholic. And then he sort of postulated a specific question. So say that we knew that God did perform miracles and God did favor believers or did answer believers' prayers. Wouldn't we be able to then use that to detect God's existence by looking at the historical record and seeing, oh, well, people get rewarded more if they believe in God, or statistically, right? You use sort of a data mining technique. Maybe God's hand in the universe was too subtle to see in olden times, right? There's too much variation, but certainly maybe with advanced data mining techniques, we might be able to get it. Now, I mean, there's several objections. The first one, which I brought up, which is sort of the sophisticated sort of data mining objection, which is, we can't really do this in strictly speaking with statistics because we don't really have an understanding of how universes operate. So in order to say, oh, well, this is the universe with miracles and it's clearly behaving differently than this universe that does not have miraculous behavior in it, we'd have to have an understanding of normal operation, which we don't. We only have one observation of the universe. But I think that there's another perhaps more interesting objection, and I think he pushed me a little bit more on this, which is, given that, perhaps God intervenes sometimes for believers, that might actually create a signal which we could detect above the noise. And if we can't detect it, isn't this an indication that God is really impotent, or that God doesn't really answer prayers? And I gave this sort of standard answer. This is what Christians have always believed, that when God answers prayers, sometimes he does not help. Sometimes people who believe actually suffer worse for that belief. There's not necessarily a correlation between being a good Christian and getting a reward from heaven. I mean, certain other religions believe this. Old Jews sometimes believe this before the Babylonian captivity. And it seems like a lot of Muslim theologians, perhaps Islamic Orthodoxy, also believes that if you're an upstanding Muslim, that means good things are necessarily going to happen to you, statistically speaking. But Christian theologians and saints have been very wary of this, and have oftentimes said even perhaps the opposite, that great suffering was the mark of great saints. And although God answers prayers, he's just as likely to answer it with the, I'm sorry you're going to have to suffer through this, as he is with the helping hand or the guardian angel. And I know. Atheists are going to think that this is the biggest cop-out in the world. I can already hear the objections, because I used to be an atheist, and I used to make these objections too. And they'll say things like, oh my God, how could you possibly say this? This is totally post hoc. You would have believed that God helped you, something good had happened, but now that something bad is happening, all you're saying is God works in mysterious ways, and that's the biggest cop-out ever. And of course, I sometimes find this is compelling, but the fact of the matter is this is not post hoc. This is what Christians have believed from the very beginning of their faith. This is not something invented in the 20th century. This is the standard Orthodox belief, and of course I know people will come back and go, oh no, this is modern rationalization, right? In the Middle Ages, people thought that if you prayed really hard to God, you'd statistically be able to gain great riches, and it's only by having the scientific record in front of us that we even understand this. And, I could point to Bible verses, I could point to saint theologians. I don't think it will convince anybody. But I think the best example might be just to ask what early Christians thought. What did an early Christian to join the church think? Did he think that by following Jesus, by worshiping this new God, that he was going to gain riches in a long life, and be, more wealthy and have his diseases cured for him? Was that a belief that he had? And I think that if you just think about it for 5 seconds, you'll realize that that's ridiculous. Nobody who became a Christian in the first century believed that. And I think it's pretty obvious, because there was a time in the first century when there was only 12 Christians, the disciples, right? There was Peter, Andrew, 2 James, Simon, Philip, John, Jude, Thomas. All 12 of them, or all 11 after Judas left, every one of them other than John was tortured to death. And that every Christian would have known this. Every Christian in the first century would have joined the religion knowing that at one time 11 men set out from Jerusalem to preach the faith of Christ, and only one of them died in his bed, an old man. I mean, you can argue a lot about the greater sophistication of science, but you're not going to convince me that people in the first century didn't know how to understand a 10 out of 11 fraction. So we can argue over whether that's a satisfying view theologically of prayer, but I think it's pretty incontestable that is the view of prayer that Christians have had since the origin of the religion. Okay, so this is sort of a shorter Ask Me Anything, and we'll see how long it gets if I put some clips in it. But as always, please use this video to ask me more questions, message me, email me. We have, of course, a monthly hangout that we do sort of on the Wednesday closest to the first of the month. And also just a favor, if anyone's out there, I'm really trying to get this video I have about slavery reparations taken down. I made a challenge video to slavery reparations supporters that they wouldn't come on and actually try to convince me that they believed that slavery reparations were a good idea. Not convince me that slavery reparations are, just convince me that they believe that slavery reparations are a good idea. And so far I've had no takers, which is sort of shaking my faith in humanity, considering that slavery reparations get defended on a pretty regular basis in the New York Times and the Atlantic and most of the mainstream media. But, maybe we can get someone on. But at any rate, thanks for watching, and I hope you guys have a great rest of the month, and I hope to see you all on this channel's comments and perhaps at the Hangouts. Have a good night.